Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Infernus, and welcome back to another comic book review. After over a month of procrastination, let's finish up the Michael Bay Transformers movies by talking about Age of Extinction and The Last Knight. The interesting thing to note about these movies is that these are the two movies in the fan base that are considered the bad ones. You'd think Revenge of the Fallen would get that title, but that movie seems to have a bit of a following in the Transformers community. Not these two, though, which I'd say is pretty interesting because I'd only really half agree with that. There's one of these movies where I can see why it has the reputation that it has, and the other one where maybe it just worked better for me than most, but I don't really see the hate. So let's start off with the movie where the former is the case, Age of Extinction. Now, I know I've had some pretty hot takes in the past, like my pretty low scores for both Mutant Mayhem and Blue Beetle. I would say Far From Home, but that one does have a bit of a low reputation. While those two could be considered hot takes, this might be my hottest take yet, which is that I think this movie's actually pretty good. It's not the best thing ever, it's not even the best movie in this franchise, nor is it even the best Michael Bay Transformers movie, but for what it's trying to do and for what it does, it's not bad. I think it executes a lot of what it does fairly well. I'd say the thing that draws me in the most with this movie is the concept. It's this idea of humans hunting down Cybertronians because of the events of the Battle of Chicago and Dark of the Moon, while working with Lockdown, who has his own agenda, and then selling those Transformers off to KSI so that they can make, you know, basically transforming vehicles for the public. Which sounds crazy, but it's interesting that it's not even that taboo of an idea for a movie like this. I mean, it's an odd premise, but considering that this is sci-fi we're talking about, you gotta suspend your disbelief at least a little bit, and this is a case where I can easily do that. Now, while the premise itself is pretty interesting and makes for a fairly engaging story, I'd say what does that job a lot better is the Cybertronian characters of this movie. I feel like this movie handles its actual Cybertronian characters a lot better than most of the other movies in this franchise. And by that I mean pretty much the rest of the Bay ones. Starting with Lockdown, since I mentioned him earlier, I'd say that he makes a pretty intimidating villain. I still think Sentinel Prime is the best villain of these five movies, but Lockdown makes for a good second place. And the two things that help him with his, high status for me, for one, it's John DiMaggio's performance, where he gives him this very, raspy but menacing tone when he speaks. And it really sells that he is this threat that can take down Optimus Prime and capture him. And the other thing is his theme. Steve Jablonsky is a great composer for all these movies, but this is one of the few cases where there are two tracks that really stick out. The first is Autobots Reunite, which is my favorite, but the other one is Lockdown's theme. Lockdown has a pretty stellar theme because it gives him this foreboding presence and really sells him as a threat. But it's not just the villain that's done pretty well here. Optimus in this franchise is generally stereotyped as way too violent for the character that he's supposed to be. Considering that G1 Optimus was so, you know, kind and fatherly, I can understand how it would feel a bit jarring to have him go from that to psychopath Decepticon killer in these movies. Here, at least, considering that in this story, him and his friends are being hunted down and killed because, of the actions of their enemies, at least here, I do sympathize with him a little bit because I can understand where he's coming from. That doesn't mean that he should still be violent psycho killer Optimus, but at least in this case, I find it's a little more excusable than it is in the previous movies. In the previous movies, it's a little over the top. The '07 movie, all that was really there was Bone Crusher, so it's not too bad. In Revenge of the Fallen, he had his weird thing with ripping off people's faces, and then in Dark of the Moon there was there was the whole Prime's rampage during the third act. In this movie, like, even though this is an Optimus that's being hunted down by humans, it's interesting that he still manages to only kill one, and it's the one antagonistic human. Other than that, his body count in this movie, really, it's just grunts. So if anything, I'd argue that this Prime is less violent than in the previous movies, which is saying something considering how I'm defending him being the angry, rageful Prime that we see in the previous movies in this one. Yeah, so Optimus is pretty decent in this movie, but the rest of the Autobot cast is pretty fun as well. I'm saying pretty a lot in this video. I need to cut that out. My issue with the Cybertronian characters in these movies has always been that they don't seem to have much of a personality outside of like a single trait, and we don't get to spend a lot of time with them, so it's hard to really connect with them as characters. The Autobots in this movie only have one of those issues, that being the single character trait. But I like that they made their traits different enough from each other to where you get some interesting banter between the team. Like, they fight a lot, but at the same time, you get the sense that they have each other's backs in this situation because, in their perspective, they're all they have. And of course, there's still some pretty fun personalities in there, like Crosshairs being just this cocky sharpshooter, and Hound being this almost washed up military guy. And then, of course, Drift as the Zen samurai, which I know he's not a samurai in his previous incarnations, but, you have to spice up the character somehow. And Bumblebee's still okay. I'll admit I'm not a huge fan of his character in these movies, but it's not enough to drag this one down. Now, I know you guys are probably waiting for me to talk about the Dinobots, but honestly, I thought they were used pretty well for what little screen time they had. I think the big issue with them is that the movie was marketed like purely with them. They were emphasized so much in the marketing that people probably expected them to be in more of the movie. They're not. They only really show up like at the end during the Battle of Hong Kong. But at the same time, I can see why some people were disappointed by the lack of screen time they had, but outside of that, I feel like for how they were used pretty well. Kind of as this sort of backup for the Autobots to take out all the KSI sentries. And of course, this is a Michael Bay Transformers movie, so as to be expected, the action and the visuals, as well as the score, are all still fantastic. That's probably never going to change with the Transformers movies at all. I think that's a point that they're all going to do really well in. Unlike the human characters. Yep, after praising this movie a bunch, this is the part where I have to start ripping into it. Now, I will say, this group of humans doesn't even compare to... what was his name? Sam's group in the original trilogy. Like, it's like comparing apples to oranges here, with Age of Extinction being the apples, and if apples were a lot better in this situation, which they are. Like, I like oranges, but apples are just... they're my preferred fruit. And in this case, this is my preferred group of humans. Granted, they're still not perfect. We could talk about the legality of Shane and Tessa's relationship. Honestly, it probably wouldn't be that bad if they didn't have that whole scene at... was it a gas station? I think it might have been a gas station. Like I said, it's been over a month since I watched either of these two movies. Like, without that scene, people probably wouldn't be questioning it that much. At least that's what I think. But, other than that, they're not really the worst characters. Cade is a bit of a hard character to like. He's not hateable. It's just that he switches from protective father figure who wants to keep his daughter safe from harm at any cost, and egotistical dickbag who wants to prove that he's just this great inventor, which, granted, he did reboot a Cybertronian, so I guess he has that feat under his belt. But at the same time, he's still not... I still wouldn't call him a great character. Good, we could debate about. Great, not so much. He doesn't exactly reach the heights of Lennox, Charlie, or even Noah and Elena in Rise of the Beasts. So they're not the worst humans. Like I said, they are a lot better than Sam's group, but they could be better. And I guess since we're talking about humans, I'll just quickly mention I don't like Joshua Joyce at all. Dude's irritating as hell. All right. So now that we've given that guy as much attention as he needs, there are still a few things that didn't work as well for me in this movie. One of which, as much as I praised Lockdown, I really don't like the fact that during the Battle of Hong Kong, they just forget about him. Like, he blasts off into space, assuming that he still has Prime as part of his cargo, only to later learn that he lost him. Now, I feel like they could have easily fixed this by including just a little scene in there where he's able to contact Galvatron and they figure something out. That would have been cool. That would have been interesting to see the two villains of the movie team up in a sense to capture Prime again. As it is, he just kind of screws off for a lot of the final battle. So it's a little hard to really be engaged with his part of the movie. Not to mention everything after that feels kind of tacked on because the movie forgets about him basically. It's like they put him front and center, then they forget about him, and then they remember that he exists. It's pretty clunky, all things considered. And Galvatron isn't exactly great either. He still has the movie 1 Megatron problem where he's just evil for the sake of being evil. And I get that he has Megatron's brain, but I would have preferred if he had more than just Megatron's personality, or at least if his personality was added to than just standard big bad evil guy that he was in the first movie. And I guess to an extent the second movie too. Third movie he had at least had some layers, but that's kind of something that they forget about. Like, that would have been so interesting if they brought that back for this movie. If he didn't like the fact that Lockdown was taking charge of the situation, so he like backstabbed him or something. Again, maybe that would have been, treading some familiar territory, but would have been more interesting than just forgetting about the main villain. Outside of those problems, I'd still argue that this is one of the better Michael Bay movies, and at least one of the better Michael Bay Transformers movies, which is something that I can't say about The Last Knight. What a mess. So I guess I'll get my good points out of the way since that's what I always do. I can at least respect that this movie's trying to keep some kind of continuity here by bringing back some of the old characters like Lennox and Simmons, and even, bringing the Witwicky name back into the picture. That I can at least respect. And as always, the action and visuals are still great. But outside of that, it's all frowns all the way down. You hear the term all smiles all the way down, but you never hear the frowns version. There's a little subversion of expectations for you. So I guess my biggest problem with this Transformers movie is that it doesn't feel much like a Transformers movie. Like, you have some good Transformers action in the beginning and end of the movie, but the entire middle section of the movie, there's just this huge chunk where it's putting more focus on this lore with the Cybertronian Knights and, Cade being the chosen one and having Prime go on Nemesis Prime. Like, it feels like it's spending more time on that than figuring out, like, what's Quintessa's big plan? How is she going to execute it? How are we going to stop her? Like, at least in the previous movies, they have something like that where it's like we learn, like, we go more in depth with what the villain's big plan is. Okay, I guess not really Revenge of the Fallen. The Fallen was extremely tacked on. But, it's it just feels weirdly paced. Again, like with Revenge of the Fallen, except at least this doesn't have some kind of excuse of a writer strike. This is just a movie where they phone in a script where it's that media saying, if you don't want to make the thing, why are you making the thing? If you don't want to make Transformers, if you want to make a medieval robot movie, make a medieval robot movie. This just feels like two different movies that they collaged into one single movie, and it's not even interesting is the unfortunate part, but I guess we can save that for later. Now, the thing with these movies is that there's at least, something about the characters that leaves somewhat of an impact, whether it be their introductory scene like with Sideswipe and the RC triplets, or interesting designs like with the Constructicons, or, a weird decision like with Devastator or with Q. Here, it's really hard to say that any of the new characters left any kind of impact. At most, there's just Hot Rod, who's Bumblebee's World War II buddy, who still has a French accent and has the Stop the Time gun, whose Studio Series figure was really disappointing, if I'm going to be completely honest. So I guess there's him, but there's still not much there to care about. And Megatron's gang is pretty much there just for the sake of having more characters. Hell, literally the only one who isn't just a reuse of old assets is Mohawk. Fantastic Studio Series figure, I will admit. Pretty much just nothing character otherwise. And even outside of that, I can't say I really cared for any of the new humans either. It's cool to see Anthony Hopkins in this movie, but I didn't really get a lot out of his character, nor did I really get much out of Cogman. He's kind of just, standard British butler, except this time he's got a stick up his ass. And I didn't care much for Vivian either. Or was her name Liz? I forget. This movie's too forgettable to really, care too much about any of these guys. And honestly, a big shame is that I can honestly say the same about the music as well. Like, the score is good, but there's no standout tracks here. Like, what did the first movie have? Arrival to Earth. What did the second movie have? Forest Battle. And debatably Rampage. What did the third movie have? It had Freeway Chase, It's Our Fight, and Sentinel Prime's theme. What did Age of Extinction have? Lockdown and Autobots Reunite. What does this movie have? A complete reuse of Arrival to Earth. I get that it's a neat track, like one of the best tracks in the franchise. That doesn't mean that you can reuse it. And, I was saying earlier that this movie dedicates a lot more time to dumping the Knight lore than, spending time with the titular Transformers. But to an extent, if it was at least interesting, I could give it some leeway, but it's kind of just not. It's very generic and honestly phoned in. That's probably the best way to describe this movie. It feels phoned in. Like, Michael Bay's gone on record to say that he wanted to stop after Dark of the Moon, but they kept making movies because the original trilogy made so much. With Age of Extinction, I can at least tell that they were trying to do something interesting. Here, this feels like they used a lot of the good ideas with AoE, and they just came up with a bunch of stuff for this movie, cobbled it together, and turned that in. That's what this feels like. It feels very phoned in, which is at least something that you can't really say for the rest of the movies. The first movie was the first movie. It was setting up the world. The second movie wasn't good, but at the very least, it's understandable how that movie feels so cobbled together because they had to do so much during a writer's strike, which, doesn't excuse the movie's quality, but it makes it more understandable at least. Third movie, end of the trilogy. Fourth movie, continuing off of where the third movie ended, and at least did some interesting things. Here, they just scrambled up a bunch of ideas into a pot and phoned it all in. And honestly, that's probably why this movie's so forgettable for me. It does so much and none of it's interesting. So, overall for the scores, Age of Extinction gets a solid 3. Pretty good for what it is. Not perfect, but it's at least better than most of what came before it and even what came after. Speaking of what came after, one of the rare ones on this show that I've done, only other one I can think of is Wonder Woman 1984 and then Suicide Squad, which honestly, if I were to, change one score in this show, it would be giving that maybe like a 1.5. It wasn't as bad as this movie or Wonder Woman 1984, and I'd still say that Wonder Woman 1984 is worse because it made some very questionable decisions. Here, again, I know I've been saying it, but it fits the movie perfectly. This feels like a very phoned-in product. You watch it, and you don't get a lot out of it because it does nothing interesting. I can kind of see why they decided to reboot after this movie because this just made a complete mess of the franchise. But anyways, guys, that's going to be it for my review on Age of Extinction and The Last Knight. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more fun content. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care, and Godspeed.